Hello, this is Fakhruddin Salahidinov, and you're watching Uz Report interview program. In this episode, we have Mr. Subir Lall, Deputy Director for Middle East and Central Asia at the IMF. And we're going to discuss the role of Central Asia in the world and the inflation rate and how the governments can tackle this challenge. Hello, Mr. Lall. Thank you for sparing your time. I know that you have pretty tough schedule.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you, Fakhruddin.
Starting our conversation, I would like to ask your opinion. So what is the role of Central Asia as a region, especially now during the times of uncertainties in the world?
Thank you. That's a very good question. It's certainly on the minds of many people and many economists as well. So the big change, of course, has been since last year due to the war in Ukraine, and given that all the countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia region have close ties with Russia. And given the disruptions associated with Russia's war in Ukraine and with the related shocks to commodity prices, oil prices, and the exchange rates, clearly Central Asia has been the focus of many changes. But in terms of the role of Central Asia, I would reframe it as saying, how can Central Asia be best positioned in this time of uncertainty? And which is, in a way, it's what the recent developments have shown is that the external shocks can affect economies unexpectedly. And although last year was very good for the region as a whole, we saw on average 4.8% growth. But it's important to remember that for a country to be resilient and economies to be resilient and to be able to grow, they should be diversified and have globally diversified as much as possible, both in terms of the geographic destinations, and in addition also in terms of the kinds of goods and services that they trade. So I think that's the real sort of takeaway from the developments, which is economic resilience is important, and which means that Central Asia and the Caucasus should become more integrated with the global economy and less reliant on any one trading partner.
I definitely agree with you on economic resilience, but let's focus on inflation. We see that the Central Asian countries, so the region, has stabilized inflation rate. However, with increased migration flow from Russia, it's getting harder to cope with the prices. For example, commodity and food prices, the housing prices. So what would be the IMF suggestions to tackle with this challenge?
In fact, that's a very good question, because inflation has been very high last year. But looking at high frequency data, what we are beginning to see is that it appears to have peaked in most countries, and in some cases has started to come down quite sharply already. For example, if you look at Georgia and Armenia, inflation has come down, and in Georgia it's already at the central bank's target or even slightly below. Absolutely right that there were several factors for the surge in inflation. Certainly remittances and moving income, which boosted domestic demand. Wage growth has been very high in the region, and that has in fact exceeded inflation for most countries. So it's been a driver of inflation in many ways. And then, of course, exchange rate depreciation and imported inflation. And of course, Uzbekistan also saw an increase in remittances and migrants, and we would agree, have positive effects on economic activity and bring skilled workers. But they can contribute to higher prices. We've seen higher rents for apartments in Tashkent, for example. And some of these pressures would subside on their own as migrants and migration and remittances normalize. And we've seen some of that already in the first quarter of 2023 across the region. More specifically, the solutions, in addition to having robust monetary policy stance and high interest rates, certainly in most countries, that's the first line of defense. and monetary policy stances in most countries are either neutral or tight. So, countries move fairly proactively. But there are other structural policies as well that can help. For instance, in Uzbekistan, the government has had several programs to make housing more affordable by building more homes and making more mortgages available. Over time, these should help by improving the supply of houses and reducing the pressure on prices and the share of income that is spent on housing, for example. That's one specific anecdote. But across the region, in addition to broader monetary policy, and of course, fiscal policy also plays a role, but there are country-specific differences as well.
You highlighted Uzbekistan and mentioned very important and key policies which are being implemented by the government. But still going through IMF annual report, I found out that IMF highlighted that inflation reduced in Uzbekistan. However, it is still above the central bank's target. So in your opinion, what could be additional policies which could be implemented to stabilize inflation?
If one looks at the macroeconomic policy mix, certainly from the monetary policy point of view, there's a positive real interest rate, as we say. So this monetary policy stance is contractionary, and the government also aims to do some fiscal consolidation this year. So they're moving in the right direction on both of those policies. And I mentioned some of the structural policies, like in housing, they should all contribute. And we should expect inflation to start easing in response to this. But of course, the impact is felt with a lag. So, and maybe that's why one would have to wait some more time to see the results of these policies show up in declining inflation.
Continuing topic on Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan is taking bold steps in reducing state intervention, diversifying the economy, and creating more jobs. So in your opinion, what could be the three top priorities for economic reforms in Uzbekistan?
The reform strategy has been underway now for a few years, and it's centered around reducing the large role of the state in the economy and creating a vibrant private sector enabling environment. And this is, of course, a huge task for any country, and it suggests several reform priorities. But since you asked, let's focus on a few key ones, and one is to continue to privatize state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. Progress has been made, of course, but many assets still remain to be sold. The new privatization law should help in ensuring a transparent and competitive process. And efforts should also focus on improving corporate governance in SOE so that those that remain with the state are run on more commercial principles and can also help ready the firms for sale. And the new competition law should also help in reducing, to level the playing field essentially between the private and public sector. A second important element is accelerating the WTO accession negotiations, because WTO membership would create new trading opportunities, raise foreign direct investment, and increase competition. And these are all important in helping modernize key sectors like agriculture to diversify the economy. And linking back to the theme I was mentioning earlier, I think one of the messages, and this is not just for Uzbekistan, but for the region as a whole, is to be more diversified, both regionally and in terms of product mix. And trade integration is an important element. The third important sort of bucket of items is improving access to high quality inputs. That includes land, labor, energy, water, and finance. And improvements in education can help, and they are needed to address the skills mismatches. Land reform should be accelerated as well, including in agriculture, to provide secure and tradable land rights. And energy and water tariffs would need to be raised to market levels, because that increases efficiency and there's less wastage. But in addition, it would also attract further investment, freeing up budget resources, and it would help with the shift towards a more green economy. Privatizing banks finally and capital market reforms would help financial intermediation and access to finance, especially for new firms and smaller firms. And those ultimately, as the evidence shows actually worldwide, is that it is often small firms that are established and grow that create the most jobs and the most improvements in living standards.
And my final question is, what is IMF's outlook for the Central Asian and specifically Uzbekistan's economic growth in 3 years? So what could be the critical risks and how can they be addressed?
So starting with the region as a whole, I mentioned we have 4.8% growth on average for the region. We expect it to ease to about 4.2% this year, and that's partly because last year's growth was so strong, and then we expect some gradual pickup. In Uzbekistan, we expect growth to be about 5.5% per year over the next 3 years. And this is basically a return to the pre-pandemic growth path of the economy. And this is, of course, assuming that continued macroeconomic stability is in place based on the policies undertaken, and economic reforms continue that promote domestic investment and opening to trade that expands greater exports and trade integration and financial flows. So the risks to the outlook, I think as the last year has been a reminder, it's about external shocks. And inward remittances went up since last year, and employment and abroad and trade also increased, but remittances appear to be declining. So, and if this trend were to continue, then we would obviously see a lower rate of remittances, not just in Uzbekistan, but across the region. And that's a risk region-wide. And similarly, adverse spillovers from global growth and volatile commodity prices that could also reduce growth in the region and in Uzbekistan. As you know, global interest rates have also been rising to deal with inflation pressures in the advanced economies, for example, and that could have a dampening effect on global growth. And, as we again learned from recent experience, volatile commodity prices are always a risk. And in Uzbekistan, of course, gold and natural gas prices are particularly important. Food prices also rose quite quickly in the last year, almost 14%. So that was important. On the domestic side, a slowdown in reform implementation or an unexpected fiscal shock, those would be two of the risks I would like to highlight. So reducing the role of the state that we discussed a few minutes ago and allocating resources efficiently, those are kind of the reforms that would help promote higher growth. And so if reform implementation is slow, then resource allocation will be less efficient than would promote the highest level of growth that the economy could achieve. And there's also a possibility that there could be fiscal liabilities from state-owned enterprises. That's always a risk when there's a large footprint of the state. And so one of the risks is that, and that's why SOE reform remains quite important as an agenda going forward.
Let me ask you just one more question, if you allow. You mentioned that IMF predicted 5.5% GDP growth in Uzbekistan this year, but a month ago, ADB released its Asian Development Outlook report, where they project 6%. So what I would like to know about why the international financial institutions, they have different figures. What could be the difference in methodology?
It's a good question. I would be actually more worried if all the forecasts came out exactly the same, because as we know, economic forecasts and what turns out in reality tend to be different, because ultimately we are trying to look ahead. So one of the main reasons we all look at the same data, maybe with slight differences, but sometimes what we do is have slightly different assumptions. So, just to give you a concrete illustration, if your assumption on remittance inflows is more conservative, you end up with a slightly lower growth rate than if you make a different assumption. So I think we have similar sort of frameworks, I would like to think, but economists always make different assumptions about the future, and that sometimes leads to these discrepancies. But it seems to me that we are not that far apart at the moment, and as as you see every year, the beginning of the year is the most difficult when one is making a forecast, and by the middle of the year and on, everybody converges more or less as more data comes in to very similar outlooks, unless there's a big unexpected shock. So I think we are roughly in the same ballpark for now.
All clear. Thank you very much for your time and hope to see you soon in Tashkent to continue our conversation in person.
Fakhruddin, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure being with you, and I look forward to seeing you too in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.